The human built a shelter for the cubs, the pack delivered her food in return. The rain on Kethera IV fell like frozen needles, each drop carrying enough force to strip bark from the native ironwood trees. Lyra Quill had been warned about the monsoon season before accepting the xenobiology research assignment. But warnings and experience were two entirely different things. Her temporary habitat dome leaked in 4 places. The portable heater was struggling against the 40-degree temperature drop, and her supply drone wouldn't arrive for another 6 days. She was miserable, cold, and completely unprepared for the creature that appeared at her observation window. The Ketheran wolf analogs officially designated Lupus catheris in the survey reports weren't supposed to come this close to human installations. They were apex predators, intelligent enough to use pack tactics that would make Earth's ancient wolves look like amateurs, and territorial enough that the initial survey team had recommended a 5-kilometer exclusion zone around any research station. This one was small, a cub, no more than a few months old, with storm gray fur plastered against its body and eyes that reflected her habitat lights like amber coins. It stared at her through the transparent aluminum, shivering violently enough that Lyra could see it from inside. "Oh no," she whispered. "Where's your pack?" The cub, she was already thinking of it as Tavik. After the Ketheran word for little storm, she'd learned from the survey notes, made a sound halfway between a whimper and a chirp. Behind it, barely visible through the sheets of rain, 2 more small shapes huddled against the rock face. Every protocol she'd been taught screamed at her not to interfere. Non-interference was the prime directive of xenobiology. She was here to observe, record, and analyze, not to play savior to every creature that wandered into her monitoring zone. The cub pressed its nose against the window, and Lyra watched another violent shiver run through its small body. "Damn it," she muttered, already moving. She couldn't bring them inside. That would be genuine madness, regardless of how pathetic they looked. But her supply cache included construction materials for emergency repairs, including thermal insulation panels and structural supports. The prefab shelter she assembled over the next hour was crude, barely more than a lean-to wedged against the rock face 10 meters from her habitat. But it had a waterproof roof, insulated walls, and it blocked the cutting wind that had been hammering the cubs. Tavik watched her work with an intensity that felt distinctly unnerving. The cub's eyes tracked every movement, every tool, every panel she locked into place. When she finally stepped back, soaked to the bone despite her weatherproof gear, the cub approached the shelter cautiously. Then it looked back at her, made a sound that was absolutely a chirp of approval, and darted inside. The other 2 cubs followed immediately. Lyra returned to her habitat, stripped off her wet clothes, and tried to convince herself she'd just committed a minor protocol violation at worst. She'd built a shelter. She hadn't fed them, hadn't touched them, hadn't truly interfered with their natural behavior. The shelter would degrade naturally when she left. It was fine. It was fine until she woke up the next morning and found the haunch. It sat directly outside her habitat's airlock, carefully placed on a flat rock. A section of local game animal, cleanly killed, and still fresh. The rain had stopped during the night, and in the mud around her habitat, she could see tracks, dozens of them. Adult tracks, 5 times the size of the cubs, circling her position like a perimeter. The pack had been here. "Oh, this is bad," Lyra said to her empty habitat. "This is very bad." She opened a comm channel to the main research station, 400 kilometers to the south. "Dr. Chen, we might have a situation." "Define situation, Quill." "I built a shelter for some Ketheron cubs last night, during the storm. Now there's meat outside my habitat." The silence that followed was long enough that Lyra checked if the connection had dropped. "You did what?" Dr. Chen finally said. "They were going to die. They were tiny. And, Lyra, do you understand what you've done?" Chen's voice had shifted from disbelief to something approaching awe. "The Ketheran wolves have a documented gift exchange protocol. It's rudimentary, but it's there. When pack members perform significant services for each other, they reciprocate. You provided shelter. They provided food. But I'm not a pack member. I'm a human." Apparently, that distinction doesn't matter to them. The gifts continued. Every morning, Lyra found something new outside her habitat. Fresh meat, mostly, but also other items. Interesting rocks. A shed antler from one of the local herbivores. Once an entire nest of edible tubers that would have taken hours to excavate. The cubs, Tavik and the other two, whom she'd mentally named Kess and Rin, had taken up permanent residence in the shelter. They ventured out to play, to practice hunting on smaller creatures, but they always returned. And the adult pack, which she never saw directly but whose presence she felt constantly, continued to leave offerings. Lyra didn't touch the meat at first. Accepting it felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But on the fourth day, when her food synthesizer failed and her emergency rations proved to be corrupted by moisture damage, she stood outside her habitat, staring at a perfectly prepared haunch of fresh game, and made a choice. She took it inside. She cooked it carefully, after running every scanner she had to ensure it was safe for human consumption. And she ate it. It was delicious. That evening, she brought out her own offering. A tarp she could spare, treated with thermal coating and waterproofing. She hung it on the side of the cub's shelter, creating an additional windbreak. Then she retreated to her habitat and waited. An hour later, the gifts changed. Instead of meat, she found tools. Not Ketharan tools, they were quadrupedal and didn't use such things but items that clearly came from somewhere else. A broken survey beacon, still partially functional. A container that had obviously been scavenged from an old landing site. Pieces of human equipment, carefully collected and delivered. "They're giving me back my own species things," Lyra told Dr. Chen over the comm. "They've been finding human artifacts and saving them for me." "The survey team lost equipment during the initial landing," Chen said slowly. "We wrote it off as unrecoverable." "Lyra, they're not just giving you random gifts, they're giving you things they think you need. Things from your own pack." The realization hit like a physical weight. The Catharans had seen her alone, separated from her kind, vulnerable to the elements, and recognized a packless individual in need. Her shelter for the cubs hadn't just been a gift, it had been a signal, a demonstration that she understood the fundamental rule of pack survival. You take care of the vulnerable, and the pack takes care of you. She was building bridges, one shelter, and one meal at a time. By the end of the month, Lyra's research had evolved into something unprecedented. She documented the gift exchange, the pack's expanding territory that now deliberately included her habitat as a protected zone, and the cubs' growing confidence. Tavik, especially, had become bold enough to approach within a few meters of her when she was outside, though some instinct always kept the final distance between them. When the supply drone finally arrived, Lyra faced a choice. She could follow protocol, pack up her research, and leave. Or she could request an extension and continue this accidental experiment in interspecies cooperation. She stood outside her habitat, watching Tavik and the other cubs play near their shelter. The one she'd built in a storm-driven moment of compassion, and made her decision. That evening, she prepared her largest offering yet. 3 more prefab shelters, larger and more sophisticated, arranged in a semicircle around a central area. Den space for the pack. She assembled them as the sun set, aware of the eyes watching from the forest's edge. When she finished, she stepped back and waited. The pack leader emerged first, massive and silver-maned, moving with the confidence of an apex predator that feared nothing. It approached the shelters cautiously, investigated each one, then looked directly at Lyra. For a long moment, Human and Ketharan regarded each other across the clearing. Then the pack leader lowered its head not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and made a sound that rumbled through the evening air like distant thunder. The next morning, Lyra found something new outside her habitat. Not meat or tools, but something far more valuable, a small pile of soft nesting material, carefully arranged. An invitation. "Dr. Chen," she said into the comm, her voice unsteady. "I'm going to need that extension. And possibly a complete rewrite of our contact protocols." "Why?" Lyra looked out at the shelters, at the cubs playing under the watchful eyes of their parents, at the pile of nesting material that represented trust, earned through nothing more complicated than kindness in a storm. "Because," she said, I think I just got adopted by a pack of apex predators. And I think they're going to teach us more about cooperation than we ever could have learned through observation alone. In the end, humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology, or its weapons, or its relentless expansion into the stars. It was simpler than that, and infinitely more powerful. The ability to see something small and vulnerable in the rain, and decide that compassion mattered more than protocol. The Ketharans understood that language perfectly.